The courtroom was cloaked in silence as Judge Theodore Grayson leaned back in his chair, a smug smile creeping across his face. His voice, laced with condescension, echoed through the room. "Miss Carter, are you aware of where you are?" he asked, his gaze fixed on a teenage girl standing at the defendant's table. Amelia Carter, with her messy curls and a simple hoodie paired with worn jeans, shifted uncomfortably. Her sneakers squeaked against the polished floor, a small sound in the oppressive stillness. Laughter rippled across the room, attorneys behind their desks exchanging amused glances at the judge's derision. "This," Judge Grayson continued, his tone mocking, "is a court of law, not a high school debate club." Amelia stood alone, dwarfed by the stack of papers she clutched as if they weighed more than her slight frame could bear. Though her cheeks flushed, her eyes stayed sharp, locked on the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm despite the ridicule. "I'm here to—" "Save it," Grayson interrupted with a dismissive wave. "This court doesn't have time for juvenile antics. I'm not sure why this nonsense was even allowed." A murmur swept through the courtroom, but Amelia held her ground. She raised her chin, her voice steady and firm. "If you'd let me speak, Your Honor, you might find it worth your time." The room gasped. A teenager addressing a judge with such audacity? Unheard of. Judge Grayson's smirk deepened into a scowl as he leaned forward. "Well, by all means," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Enlighten us." Amelia took a deep breath, adjusted her papers, and began. What followed left the courtroom stunned. As she spoke, delivering a seamless argument, she cited legal precedents, constitutional clauses, and court procedures with ease. Her knowledge was impeccable, her confidence unshakable, and, most astonishingly, her argument was correct. The attorneys who had laughed moments earlier now scribbled notes furiously, their faces pale. Judge Grayson's expression shifted from amused superiority to disbelief. "Who are you?" he blurted out, leaning forward. His voice was no longer mocking but tinged with genuine bewilderment. Amelia met his gaze with a faint, knowing smile. "I'm Amelia Carter," she said evenly, "and I'm here to defend my client." The room erupted into chaos. Questions flew in every direction. Judge Grayson banged his gavel, demanding order, but his own composure was clearly shaken. How could a teenager command the courtroom like this? Who had allowed her to take the stand? And then, for the first time, Amelia's confident smile faltered. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face, silencing the room again. 2 weeks earlier, Amelia Carter had been sitting in her tiny bedroom, surrounded by piles of law books and legal pads. The books weren't hers. They had belonged to her older brother, James, who had been studying for the bar exam. But James wasn't there anymore, and Amelia had taken it upon herself to finish what he'd started. Her best friend, Lily, had thought she was crazy. "What are you even doing?" Lily asked one afternoon, sitting cross-legged on Amelia's bed with a bag of chips. "You're like 16. You're not a lawyer." Amelia's pen hovered over her notebook, where she had been carefully summarizing case law. She glanced up at Lily, her expression serious. "I don't care what people think. I have to do this." "But why?" Lily pressed, her voice softening. "Why can't you just let it go?" Amelia didn't answer right away. She flipped through one of James's worn textbooks, her brow furrowed in determination. Finally, she said, "Because someone has to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. And James believed I could." Lily didn't argue after that. Instead, she watched in silence as Amelia threw herself into her studies, preparing for something that seemed impossible. What Amelia didn't tell Lily, what she didn't tell anyone, was that her obsession with the law wasn't just about helping others. It was about proving something to herself. After James's death, the people around her had started treating her like a fragile child. Teachers, neighbors, even her own parents spoke to her in hushed tones, as if one wrong word might shatter her completely. But she wasn't fragile, and she wasn't a child. She was smart, she was determined, and she was going to prove to everyone, no, to herself, that she could make a difference. Back in the courtroom, Amelia's composure returned, but the tension in the air was palpable. Judge Grayson, still visibly rattled, leaned back in his chair, studying her closely. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "you're telling me you're representing the defendant?" Amelia nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "And where exactly did you study law?" he asked, his skepticism now devoid of mockery. "I didn't go to law school, if that's what you're asking," Amelia replied, her voice unwavering. "But I've spent the last year studying legal texts and court procedures. I've read every case related to this matter, and I believe I'm qualified to represent my client." The judge raised an eyebrow, his tone sharp. "You believe you're qualified? That's not how this works." Amelia didn't flinch. "Then let me prove it," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the silence. The courtroom held its collective breath, all eyes on Judge Grayson, waiting to see what he would do next. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding creak. A tall man in a crisp gray suit strode in, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. "Your Honor," the man said, his deep, authoritative voice commanding immediate attention. "I believe I can shed some light on this situation." Amelia turned to look at him, her confidence faltering for the first time. Uncertainty flickered across her face. Who was this man, and what did he want? The stranger's presence was magnetic. He moved with an air of authority, his briefcase swinging lightly in one hand. The sharp cut of his suit and the precision in his stride contrasted starkly with Amelia's simple hoodie and jeans. The courtroom's focus shifted entirely to him, murmurs spreading like wildfire as everyone speculated on his identity and purpose. "Excuse me, sir," Judge Grayson said, his tone regaining its usual authority. "Who are you, and what business do you have interrupting my courtroom?" The man came to a stop just before the bench, setting his briefcase down with practiced care. He turned to face the judge and offered a polite nod. "My apologies, Your Honor. My name is Daniel Hayes, and I'm here as a representative of the Bar Association." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at him, trying to decipher his intentions. Her grip on the stack of papers tightened. Why would someone from the Bar Association be here? Was this about her? Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The Bar Association? And what interest do they have in this case? Mr. Hayes opened his briefcase, flipping through a folder with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "It's not the case itself, Your Honor," he explained. "It's the matter of representation." He glanced briefly at Amelia, making her stomach twist before continuing. "We received an anonymous tip about an unlicensed individual attempting to represent a client in court. Naturally, this is a matter we take very seriously." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Amelia felt her heart sink. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, and now it felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Forcing herself to stand tall, she swallowed hard and pushed the fear aside. "Unlicensed?" Judge Grayson repeated, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well, Mr. Hayes, I'm sure you can see why this is highly irregular. As I was just saying, Miss Carter has no formal legal training. Her presence here is questionable at best." Before Mr. Hayes could respond, Amelia stepped forward. Her voice was steady, though an edge of desperation bled through. "Your Honor, I understand this is unusual, but I've done the research. I've prepared for this case as thoroughly as any lawyer would. My client deserves a fair defense." Judge Grayson's smirk widened. "Miss Carter, this is a court of law, not a stage for theatrics. Do you even realize the seriousness of what you're attempting?" "I do," Amelia said quickly, her voice unwavering. "And I also realize that my client's life could be ruined if they don't have someone fighting for them." A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the attorneys who had dismissed her earlier were now looking at her with a hint of respect. Judge Grayson's frown deepened, displeased by the shift in tone. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat, redirecting the room's attention. "Your Honor, while I agree that the situation is unconventional, I believe it's only fair to hear Miss Carter out. After all, the law is meant to ensure justice, not suppress it." The judge's frown remained, his gaze bouncing between Mr. Hayes and Amelia as he weighed his options. Finally, He sighed and leaned forward, his gavel resting in his hand. "Fine," he said, his tone begrudging. "Miss Carter, I'll allow you to continue, temporarily. But if I find you're wasting this court's time, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Amelia replied, relief flooding her voice. She took a deep breath and prepared to continue her argument. Amelia hadn't always been this fearless. Just a year ago, she had been an ordinary teenager, more concerned with hanging out with her friends than fighting legal battles. But everything changed the day her brother James was arrested. James had been Amelia's hero, smart, kind, and fiercely protective. He had been just 2 months away from finishing law school when he got into an altercation with a wealthy businessman outside a bar. The man claimed James had assaulted him, and despite James's insistence that it was self-defense, he was arrested and charged. Amelia's parents had tried to help, but they didn't have the resources to hire a top-tier attorney. The overworked public defender assigned to James's case barely put up a fight in court. In the end, James was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The conviction devastated Amelia. Watching her brother, a man who had dedicated his life to justice, fall victim to the very system he believed in shattered her faith in fairness. But instead of giving up, she decided to fight. She would learn the law herself, and she would find a way to make things right. Back in the courtroom, Amelia launched into her argument with renewed determination. Her voice was steady, her words precise, as she meticulously laid out the evidence in her client's favor. The client, a middle-aged man named Mr. Peterson, sat beside her, his face a mix of hope and terror. He had been accused of embezzling funds from his employer, a charge he vehemently denied. Amelia presented documents that revealed glaring discrepancies in the company's financial records, hinting that someone else might be responsible. She quoted legal precedents with confidence, underscoring her client's right to a thorough investigation. The courtroom was silent, hanging on her every word. Even Judge Grayson leaned forward in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a fleeting moment, Amelia felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. But then, Mr. Hayes stood. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm yet firm. "While Ms. Carter's argument is impressive, it doesn't change the fact that she is not a licensed attorney. Allowing her to continue sets a dangerous precedent." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, tension rippling through the air like an electric current. Judge Grayson's gaze sharpened as it fell on Amelia. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone heavy with authority, "I'll give you one last chance to explain yourself. Who gave you the authority to act as legal counsel in this case?" Amelia froze. She had prepared for this question, rehearsed her response 100 times. But now, under the judge's scrutiny, her confidence wavered. She drew in a deep breath, willing herself to speak. The courtroom doors creaked open. All eyes turned as a young boy, no older than 10, stepped inside. He was clutching a crumpled envelope, his small frame trembling under the weight of so many stares. "Hey, Amelia," the boy called out, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a lifeline. Amelia's breath hitched. Her eyes widened in shock. "Ethan," she whispered. The boy ran toward her, thrusting the envelope into her hands. "You forgot this," he said, his voice filled with urgency. Amelia stared at the envelope, her heart pounding in her chest. She recognized it instantly. It was something she had never intended to reveal. Not here, not now. But with the entire courtroom watching, there was no escape. Her hands trembled as she took the envelope from Ethan. The weight of 1,000 eyes bore down on her. "Miss Carter," Judge Grayson's voice cut through the silence, sharp and demanding. "What's in that envelope?" Amelia's throat tightened. Her mind raced, searching for an answer, an escape, anything to deflect the attention. It's nothing that concerns this case, Your Honor," she managed, though her voice faltered. Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Miss Carter, you're already walking a thin line. If you're withholding something pertinent to these proceedings, I assure you, it will not end well for you." Ethan tugged gently at her sleeve, his wide, innocent eyes looking up at her. "Show them, Amelia," he whispered. Her heart sank. He didn't understand the consequences of what he was asking her to do. She glanced at Mr. Peterson, whose expression mirrored her own confusion and fear. Amelia's fingers hovered over the envelope's seal, but before she could act, Mr. Hayes interjected. "Your Honor," he said, his tone measured, "this envelope, whatever it contains, is irrelevant to the matter at hand. We're here to discuss Ms. Carter's qualifications, or lack thereof, to represent a client." Judge Grayson raised a hand, silencing Hayes. "I'll determine what's relevant, Mr. Hayes." The weight of the decision pressed down on Amelia like a physical force. If she revealed the contents of the envelope, it could derail everything. But if she refused, the judge would likely hold her in contempt. "Miss Carter," Judge Grayson said, his voice now a low warning, "I won't ask you again. Open the envelope." Amelia glanced at Ethan, then at Mr. Peterson, and finally back at the judge. With no other choice, she slowly tore open the envelope and pulled out its contents. Inside was a letter, handwritten in her brother James's neat, meticulous script. Amelia's throat tightened as she unfolded it, the familiar words blurring before her eyes. It was a plea, a message James had written to her before he was sent to prison. The letter was filled with encouragement, hope, and a challenge to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, no matter how impossible it seemed. Amelia's hands trembled as she held the letter, unsure of what to do. The courtroom waited, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "What is it, Miss Carter?" Judge Grayson's voice was softer now, almost curious. Amelia hesitated, then folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. "It's personal," she said firmly, meeting the judge's gaze. "And it has nothing to do with this case." For a moment, the judge said nothing. The room held its breath. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Fine," he said. "But understand this, Miss Carter. This is your last chance. Any further disruptions, and I'll have no choice but to remove you from this courtroom." Relief washed over Amelia as she nodded. She glanced at Ethan, giving him a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you," she whispered, ruffling his hair. "Go sit with Lily now." Ethan nodded and scampered to the back of the courtroom, where Amelia's best friend, Lily, sat watching anxiously. Amelia turned back to the judge, ready to continue her argument, but the courtroom doors burst open once again. This time, it wasn't a child or a lawyer who entered. It was a tall, stern-looking woman in a dark blazer, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She carried herself with an air of authority, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she strode forward. "Your Honor," the woman said, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "My name is Margaret Steele. I'm with the District Attorney's Office, and I'm here to address a matter of great importance." Judge Grayson frowned, his irritation evident. "Miss Steele, this is highly irregular. What matter could possibly justify interrupting my courtroom?" Margaret's gaze shifted to Amelia, her expression unreadable. "It concerns the unauthorized presence of this individual," she said, gesturing toward Amelia, "and the consequences of allowing her to continue." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Amelia's stomach dropped. Margaret Steele wasn't here to support her. She was here to tear her down. "Order!" Judge Grayson barked, his gavel striking the bench with force. "Miss Steele, you will explain yourself now?" Margaret nodded, calm and composed. "Of course, Your Honor. I've come to inform this court that if Miss Carter is allowed to proceed, it will constitute a serious violation of legal ethics. As a representative of the District Attorney's Office, it is my duty to ensure the integrity of this court is upheld." Amelia's heart pounded as her world seemed to collapse around her. She had fought so hard to be here, only to have the system itself conspire against her. But she wouldn't give up, not when so much was at stake. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the fear churning inside her, "I respectfully request the chance to prove myself. I may not have a law degree, but I've done the work, I've studied the law, and I believe I'm the best person to defend my client." Judge Grayson studied her, his face unreadable. His eyes flicked between Margaret Steele, Mr. Hayes, and the packed courtroom. The tension was suffocating, the room holding its collective breath. Finally, he spoke. "I'll allow this hearing to continue," he said firmly. "But Miss Carter, You are now on very thin ice. If you falter even once, I won't hesitate to shut this down. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor, Amelia replied, relief softening her voice. But the reprieve was short-lived. Margaret stepped forward again, a smirk curling at the corners of her mouth. In that case, Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness. Amelia's blood ran cold. Witness? What witness? She wasn't prepared for this. As Margaret turned toward the door, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. A man entered, and Amelia's breath hitched. She recognized him instantly, the businessman who had accused her brother, James. Her stomach twisted as he walked in, exuding arrogance in his tailored navy suit. He glanced at her, his smirk sharp enough to cut. Your Honor, Margaret announced, gesturing toward him. This is Mr. Victor Grant. His testimony is crucial to establishing why Miss Carter cannot continue as legal counsel. Amelia's mind raced. Why was he here? What did Margaret have planned? Judge Grayson frowned, skepticism lacing his tone. Mr. Grant's presence is highly irregular. Miss Steele, explain why his testimony is relevant. With respect, Your Honor, Margaret began smoothly. Mr. Grant has valuable insight into Miss Carter's background and motivations. His testimony will expose the underlying issues that make her unsuitable to act as legal counsel, even in an unconventional capacity. Amelia's palms grew clammy. This was an ambush, plain and simple. She glanced at Mr. Peterson, her client, who looked increasingly uneasy. She needed to act fast but couldn't let them see her panic. Your Honor, she said, stepping forward, I object to this witness. His testimony has no bearing on the facts of this case. Judge Grayson raised a hand, silencing her. Miss Carter, I'll decide what's relevant. Mr. Grant, take the stand. Victor Grant strode to the witness stand, his smirk unwavering as he was sworn in. Amelia fought to stay calm, but seeing him, the man who had destroyed her brother's future, made her blood boil. Mr. Grant, Margaret began. Can you describe your prior interactions with Miss Carter? Grant's eyes gleamed. Of course, he said, his voice smooth and confident. I first encountered Miss Carter during her brother's trial. He was convicted of assaulting me after a heated altercation outside a bar. The evidence was clear, and the court found him guilty. The courtroom murmured, the sound like static in Amelia's ears. Her face burned as she clenched her fists. Grant wasn't just revisiting the past. He was twisting it. And how did Miss Carter behave during that time? Margaret asked, her tone laced with mock concern. Disruptive, Grant replied, feigning innocence. She attended every hearing, glaring at me like I was some kind of villain. Even after the trial, she wouldn't let it go. Sent letters, made phone calls, trying to reopen the case. It was obsessive. Amelia took a step forward. Your Honor, this has nothing to do with Mr. Peterson's case. This is a personal attack designed to discredit me. Judge Grayson gave her a sharp look. Miss Carter, you'll have your turn to respond. Sit down. Reluctantly, she obeyed, her mind churning. Grant's words stung, not because they were entirely untrue, but because of how he weaponized them. Yes, she had fought for James after his conviction. Yes, she had written letters and made phone calls. But it wasn't out of obsession. It was out of love, out of a desperate need to prove her brother's innocence. Miss Steele continued, her voice crisp and cutting. Mr. Grant, in your opinion, does Miss Carter's behavior during her brother's trial suggest she is fit to represent a client in a legal setting? Absolutely not, Grant replied, shaking his head for emphasis. She's emotionally unstable and has no respect for the legal system. Allowing her to act as counsel isn't just inappropriate, it's dangerous. The words hit Amelia like a punch to the gut. She gripped the edges of the defendant's table, fighting to maintain her composure. She wanted to scream, to call Grant a liar, to remind everyone that he was the one who had destroyed her family. But she refused to let him see her break. Miss Steele turned to the judge, her expression triumphant. Your Honor, this testimony demonstrates precisely why Miss Carter should not be allowed to continue. Her actions during her brother's trial show a blatant lack of professionalism and objectivity. She is unfit to represent anyone in court. Amelia shot to her feet, her voice rising above the murmurs spreading through the courtroom. Your Honor, this is absurd. Mr. Grant is not a neutral party. He's the man who falsely accused my brother. The courtroom erupted into a storm of whispers. Order! Judge Grayson thundered, banging his gavel. Miss Carter, you will conduct yourself appropriately, or I will hold you in contempt. Amelia took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but firm. Your Honor, Mr. Grant's testimony is biased and irrelevant. If this court is truly interested in justice, then I respectfully request the opportunity to cross-examine him. The judge hesitated, his gaze narrowing as he considered her words. Finally, he nodded. Very well, Miss Carter. You may proceed. Amelia stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. This was her chance to turn the tables, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. Grant was a master manipulator, and with Miss Steele backing him, the odds were stacked against her. Mr. Grant, she began, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the room. You claim that my actions during my brother's trial were disruptive. Can you provide specific examples? Grant smirked, his confidence unshaken. I don't have to. Everyone in that courtroom saw how you behaved. That's not an answer, Amelia said calmly. If you're going to accuse me of being disruptive, then you need to provide evidence. Otherwise, your testimony is just opinion. Grant's smirk faltered slightly. Fine. You were loud, argumentative, and refused to accept the court's decision. And do you believe those actions, motivated by a desire to fight for my brother's innocence, make me incapable of defending my client today? Yes, Grant said bluntly. You're too emotional to handle a case like this. Amelia's eyes narrowed. Too emotional. Or too determined to stop people like you from exploiting the system for your own gain. The courtroom gasped. Miss Carter, watch your tone, Judge Grayson warned, leaning forward. Amelia nodded, but kept her gaze locked on Grant. Mr. Grant, let's talk about the evidence in my brother's case, specifically the security footage from the bar. Do you recall why it was never admitted in court? Grant's face darkened. It was ruled inadmissible. Why? Amelia pressed, her voice sharp and unrelenting. Was it because it contradicted your claim of assault? Grant shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'm not here to discuss your brother's case. No, Amelia said, taking a step closer, her tone unwavering. You're here to discredit me. But if we're going to question my credibility, then we need to question yours, too. The room was electric, the tension palpable. Grant opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a loud crash echoed from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned. A man stood in the doorway, his face pale and his breathing labored. In his trembling hand, he held up a USB drive. I have evidence, he said, his voice shaking but resolute. Evidence that proves everything she's saying is true. The courtroom erupted into chaos once again. Amelia froze, her heart racing. Who was this man? What evidence did he have? And more importantly, how was it connected to her case? The man stumbled forward, clutching the USB drive as if it were his lifeline. His disheveled suit and haunted eyes told a story of sleepless nights and agonizing decisions. Judge Grayson banged his gavel, his voice cutting through the noise. Order in the court. Who are you? And what is the meaning of this interruption? The man stopped, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. My name is Henry Willis, he said, his voice shaky but loud enough to reach every corner of the room. I used to work for Victor Grant. A ripple of whispers swept through the courtroom. Victor Grant's face turned ghostly pale, his earlier smugness vanishing. He shot to his feet, his voice sharp. Your Honor, I object to this man's intrusion. He has no business here. Judge Grayson's stern gaze flicked between Willis and Grant. Mr. Willis, you've disrupted my courtroom. This better be important. Willis nodded emphatically, holding up the USB drive. Your Honor, I have evidence that contradicts Mr. Grant's testimony. It's footage from the night of the incident involving Amelia's brother. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The footage. The security footage that had been withheld during James's trial. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. Victor Grant's voice was laced with fury. This is outrageous. That footage was deemed inadmissible years ago. It's irrelevant now. Willis's voice grew steadier, emboldened by the weight of the truth. It wasn't inadmissible. It was suppressed. By you, Mr. Grant. The courtroom exploded into chaos, voices clashing and overlapping, as the truth began to unravel. Judge Grayson banged his gavel repeatedly, his patience visibly wearing thin. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. Amelia's heart raced as her eyes darted toward Willis. She didn't know who he was or why he had chosen this moment to step forward, but she could feel the momentum shifting. This wasn't just an opportunity to defend Mr. Peterson. It was a chance to uncover the truth about her brother's case. Judge Grayson fixed Willis with a stern gaze. Mr. Willis, do you have any proof to support these claims? Willis nodded, holding up the USB drive once more. It's all here, Your Honor. The footage, along with records showing how it was deliberately suppressed. Grant's face contorted with fury. Your Honor, this man is lying. He's a disgruntled former employee, trying to settle a personal vendetta. Amelia stood, her voice steady but urgent. Your Honor, if this evidence is genuine, it could prove that my brother was wrongfully convicted. It could also demonstrate that Mr. Grant's testimony here today is biased and unreliable. The judge rubbed his temples, exasperation evident in his furrowed brow. This case is about Mr. Peterson, not your brother, Miss Carter. However, if there's evidence that speaks to the credibility of a key witness, it must be considered. Grant's jaw tightened, his voice rising in desperation. This is a farce, Your Honor. I demand you throw this man out and strike his claims from the record. Judge Grayson ignored him, turning to the bailiff. Retrieve the drive and have it reviewed by our IT specialist. We will determine its authenticity. The bailiff crossed the courtroom, took the USB drive from Willis, and exited to deliver it to the IT team. The tension in the room was suffocating, every gaze fixed on Grant. The confident accuser now looked like a man cornered, his composure unraveling. Amelia's thoughts churned as the courtroom waited. If the footage was real, it could vindicate her brother and expose Victor Grant as a fraud. But why had Willis come forward now, after so much time? She glanced at Mr. Peterson, who was watching the proceedings with a mix of confusion and hope. I'm sorry this is getting so complicated, she whispered. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. Don't apologize. You're fighting harder for me than anyone else ever has. Her chest tightened at his words. She hadn't expected to feel so connected to Mr. Peterson's plight. He reminded her of James, falsely accused, with the odds stacked against him. She resolved to keep fighting, no matter what. After what felt like an eternity, the bailiff returned, handing a laptop to the judge. Your Honor, he said, his tone firm, the footage is authentic. It has not been tampered with. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Grayson nodded, his expression unreadable. Play the footage. The laptop screen was turned toward the court, and the bailiff hit play. The grainy black and white video displayed the bar on the night of the altercation. Victor Grant sat at a table with several associates, laughing and drinking. Moments later, James appeared on the screen, calm and composed. He approached Grant, said something inaudible, and then turned to leave. What happened next froze the courtroom. As James walked away, Grant stood abruptly, grabbed his arm, and shoved him. James turned, clearly attempting to de-escalate the situation, but Grant threw the first punch. The ensuing scuffle was brief but undeniable. Grant was the aggressor. Tears stung Amelia's eyes as she watched. This was the truth, the proof her brother had acted in self-defense. She glanced at Grant, whose face was now flushed a deep, furious red. The footage ended, leaving the room in stunned silence. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Mr. Grant, he said, his voice cold. Care to explain this? Grant stammered, his confidence shattered. Your Honor, I don't know what this man is trying to pull, but— Enough, Judge Grayson interrupted. This court will not tolerate perjury or obstruction of justice. Mr. Hayes, he turned to the opposing counsel, I suggest you reevaluate the value of this witness's testimony. Daniel Hayes, who had remained silent during the chaos, nodded slowly. Understood, Your Honor. Amelia stepped forward, her voice steady but commanding. Your Honor, this evidence not only discredits Mr. Grant, but it also calls into question the integrity of his accusations against my brother. I respectfully request that this court consider his testimony with extreme caution moving forward. Judge Grayson nodded. Duly noted, Miss Carter. But let me remind you, this case is about Mr. Peterson. Keep your focus on defending your client. Yes, Your Honor, Amelia replied, though her mind raced with possibilities. This evidence could save Mr. Peterson and reopen her brother's case. As the courtroom settled, Miss Steele rose, her expression icy. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, I request a brief recess to regroup. The judge sighed, glancing at the clock. Fine. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. The courtroom emptied, leaving Amelia alone at the defendant's table. Her fingers tapped nervously against the wood as her thoughts swirled. The footage had been a game-changer, proof of Victor Grant's lies and her brother's innocence. But she knew this was only the beginning. People like Grant didn't crumble without a fight, and Miss Steele wasn't the type to give up easily. Whatever they had planned next would be even more dangerous. Lily slid into the seat beside Amelia, Ethan trailing close behind. That was insane, Lily whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. You totally crushed him. Amelia managed a faint smile. It's not over yet. Ethan tugged on her sleeve, his wide eyes brimming with excitement. You're going to win, right? You're going to prove everyone wrong. Amelia looked down at him, her heart aching. She didn't want to make promises she might not be able to keep. I'm going to try my best, Ethan. That's all I can do. The boy nodded, seemingly satisfied. Lily leaned in closer, lowering her voice. Who was that guy? The one with the USB? Amelia shook her head. I have no idea. But if he hadn't shown up when he did, she trailed off, unwilling to imagine how much worse things could have turned out. 30 minutes later, the courtroom reconvened, the tension palpable as everyone returned to their seats. Whispers rippled through the room like a rising tide. Victor Grant had reappeared, his face set in a stony expression. Beside him, Miss Steele stood tall, her sharp demeanor betraying no signs of doubt. Judge Grayson entered, his gavel striking down sharply. Let's get back to business. Miss Carter, the floor is yours. Amelia rose, her pulse quickening. She had prepared meticulously for this case, but now the stakes felt higher than ever. With Grant's credibility in shambles, she knew Miss Steele would go on the offensive. Every word Amelia spoke needed to count. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady, as I've demonstrated, there are significant flaws in the prosecution's case against my client, Mr. Peterson. The evidence presented so far lacks both credibility and substance. I intend to show that the accusations against him are not only unfounded but part of a larger effort to scapegoat an innocent man. She launched into her argument, presenting documents, financial records, and timelines that contradicted the claims against her client. Her delivery was clear and methodical, each point building upon the last. The courtroom hung on her every word, even Judge Grayson, who occasionally nodded, grudgingly impressed. When she finished, Miss Steele stood, her lips pressed into a thin line. Your Honor, while Miss Carter's presentation was thorough, it does not absolve her client of the charges. In fact, I have additional evidence that I believe will solidify the case against Mr. Peterson. Miss Steele motioned to a clerk, who handed her a folder. Your Honor, this document outlines a series of emails exchanged between Mr. Peterson and another employee at his company. These emails suggest his involvement in the alleged embezzlement. She passed the documents to the judge, who examined them closely. His expression darkened. Amelia's heart sank as she glanced at Mr. Peterson, who looked as though he'd been punched in the gut. Emails? Amelia asked, her voice sharp. Your Honor, may I review the documents? The judge handed them over. As Amelia scanned the pages, her stomach churned. The emails appeared legitimate, complete with timestamps and headers matching company records. They painted a damning picture of Mr. Peterson conspiring to siphon funds. But something didn't sit right. The language was too blunt, too careless. Amelia turned to Miss Steele. Your Honor, I'd like to question the authenticity of these emails. Given the inconsistencies we've already seen in this case, it's not unreasonable to suspect this evidence may have been fabricated. Miss Steele's eyes narrowed. Are you accusing the prosecution of falsifying evidence, Miss Carter? I'm saying we need to verify the source, Amelia replied firmly. If these emails are real, they'll hold up under scrutiny. If not, she let the sentence hang, the implication clear. The judge leaned forward. Miss Steele, how were these emails obtained? They were provided by an anonymous source within the company, Miss Steele said smoothly. The prosecution has verified their legitimacy. Amelia's jaw tightened. Anonymous source. How convenient. Your Honor, I request that the emails be subjected to forensic analysis to confirm their authenticity. Judge Grayson considered her request, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. Very well. The court will recess until the emails can be reviewed by an independent forensic expert. For the briefest moment, Miss Steele's composure faltered, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. Amelia caught it and felt a spark of hope. She wasn't backing down, not now. During the recess, Amelia sat with Mr. Peterson in a quiet corner of the courthouse. The man looked defeated, his shoulders slumped, and his hands trembling slightly. I didn't send those emails, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I swear I didn't. I believe you, Amelia said gently. We'll prove it. Mr. Peterson shook his head. It doesn't matter. They've already decided I'm guilty. You've seen how they look at me. Amelia reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You're not guilty, and I won't let them railroad you. You have to trust me. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a glimmer of hope. You remind me of my daughter, he said softly. She never gave up on anyone either. Amelia's throat tightened. Then I won't give up on you. Hours later, the courtroom reconvened. The forensic analyst stood at the witness stand, holding a report. The tension in the room was electric as Judge Grayson addressed him. Have you completed your analysis of the emails? Yes, Your Honor, the analyst said, his voice clear. And my findings are conclusive. The emails in question were forged. Gasps filled the courtroom. Amelia felt a surge of vindication as she turned to Miss Steele, whose face was a mask of barely concealed fury. The judge banged his gavel sharply. This is a serious development, Miss Steele. The court will not tolerate the submission of falsified evidence. You will need to explain how this occurred. Miss Steele opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Victor Grant shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. He pointed a shaking finger at Amelia. This is all her doing, he shouted. She's manipulating this court to serve her own agenda. Enough. Judge Grayson barked, slamming his gavel again. Mr. Grant, sit down, or I'll have you removed. Grant hesitated for a moment, then sank back into his seat, seething. Amelia's heart pounded as she watched him. She could feel it. Something was about to happen, and then it did. The door to the courtroom creaked open, and a man entered. He was tall and gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted expression. His gaze locked on Amelia, his face tight with emotion. I need to speak, the man said, his voice steady but strained. I'm the one who forged the emails, and I did it because Victor Grant told me to. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Gasps, shouts, and whispers filled the air, the weight of the man's confession crashing over the room like a thunderclap. Judge Grayson slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice rising above the uproar. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. The man stood frozen near the entrance, his eyes darting between Victor Grant and the judge. He looked torn between bolting and committing to the storm he had just unleashed. Step forward, Judge Grayson commanded, his tone sharp and unyielding. State your name and explain yourself. The man hesitated before slowly walking toward the stand, each step heavy with reluctance. My name is William Tate, he said, his voice trembling. I worked for Mr. Grant. Victor Grant sprang to his feet again, his face twisted with rage. Your Honor, this man is lying. He's a disgruntled employee, trying to drag me down with baseless accusations. Mr. Grant, Judge Grayson thundered. You will sit down and remain silent until it's your turn to speak. Grant's jaw clenched, but he obeyed, sinking into his seat, his glare sharp enough to cut through steel. Amelia watched him closely, her instincts screaming that he was on the verge of losing control. "Mr. Tate," the judge said, turning his attention back to the man, "you've made a serious allegation. I suggest you explain yourself quickly and clearly." Tate nodded, swallowing hard. "I was hired by Mr. Grant to falsify those emails," he began, his voice cracking. "He told me to make it look like Mr. Peterson was guilty of embezzlement. He said it was just a necessary step to protect the company's reputation." The room erupted again, but Judge Grayson's gavel struck down with renewed force. "Order. I will not ask again." Amelia's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. Tate's confession was a bombshell, but it raised more questions than answers. Why had he come forward now? And what else was Grant hiding? "Mr. Tate," the judge continued, "do you have any evidence to support these claims?" Tate nodded quickly and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small hard drive. "Everything's on here," he said. "Emails, instructions, payments, everything." The bailiff stepped forward to retrieve the hard drive. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "This court will review the contents. Until then, we will proceed with extreme caution." He turned to Amelia. "Miss Carter, do you wish to question this witness?" Amelia stood, drawing on her resolve to steady her racing pulse. "Yes, Your Honor." She approached the stand, locking eyes with Tate. His hands fidgeted in his lap, beads of sweat dotting his forehead. He looked like a man teetering on the edge. "Mr. Tate," she began, her voice calm but firm, "why are you coming forward now?" Tate hesitated, his gaze flickering briefly to Grant before returning to Amelia. "I couldn't live with it anymore," he said, his voice strained with emotion. "At first, I thought it was just business, just following orders. But then I saw how far it was going, how many people it was hurting. And I have a daughter. I couldn't look her in the eye, knowing I'd done something like this." Amelia nodded, her tone softening. "You're saying Mr. Grant directly instructed you to falsify evidence against my client?" "Yes," Tate said firmly. "He told me exactly what to do and paid me to keep quiet." "Did he threaten you in any way?" Amelia asked, her voice steady but probing. Tate hesitated, then nodded. "He said if I didn't do it, he'd ruin me. Said he'd make sure I never worked in this industry again." Amelia glanced at Judge Grayson, who leaned forward, listening intently. "Your Honor, I believe this testimony casts significant doubt on Mr. Grant's credibility in the prosecution's case. I request that this court take immediate action to ensure Mr. Grant is held accountable for his actions." Judge Grayson nodded slowly, his expression grave. "This court takes these allegations very seriously. The evidence on this hard drive will be reviewed promptly. In the meantime, Mr. Grant, you are hereby ordered to remain in the courthouse until further notice." Grant's face twisted with fury, but he didn't argue. His confident facade had crumbled, leaving him visibly shaken. As the court recessed to review the new evidence, Amelia sat quietly in a corner of the courthouse. Her mind raced. She had anticipated resistance, but this, the lengths Grant had gone to, was staggering. Yet, for the first time, the truth was beginning to shine through the cracks. Lily and Ethan joined her in the hallway. "You were amazing in there," Lily said, her voice hushed but brimming with excitement. "Tate's confession?" Total mic drop. Amelia managed a faint smile, exhaustion creeping in. "It's not over yet. Steele still has cards to play, and Grant's not going down without a fight." Ethan tugged on her sleeve. "Are you scared?" She looked at him, her expression softening. "A little. But sometimes, doing the right thing means being scared and doing it anyway." When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was taut with tension. The forensic analyst returned to the stand, holding a detailed report. "Your Honor," he began, "the hard drive's contents have been confirmed as genuine. It contains a trail of emails, payments, and instructions directly linking Victor Grant to the fabricated evidence." Judge Grayson's face was grim as he turned to Grant. "Mr. Grant, this court is deeply troubled by the evidence presented. You are hereby detained for further investigation into your conduct. Bailiffs, take him into custody. The courtroom erupted in gasps as the bailiffs approached Grant. He shot to his feet, his face contorted with anger. You'll regret this, he hissed, his glare fixed on Amelia. You think you've won? This isn't over. Amelia held his gaze, refusing to flinch. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the realization that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling. As the bailiffs escorted Grant out, the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence. Miss Steele rose, her expression as sharp as ever. Your Honor, while this development is significant, it does not absolve the defendant. The charges against Mr. Peterson still stand. Amelia stood, her voice firm. Your Honor, with respect, every piece of evidence against my client has been discredited. The prosecution's case is built on lies, and it's clear Mr. Peterson was framed. Judge Grayson nodded slowly, his tone decisive. I agree. Based on the evidence presented, the charges against Mr. Peterson are hereby dismissed. The words hit Amelia like a wave of relief. She turned to Mr. Peterson, who looked stunned. You're free, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. It's over. But even as the courtroom erupted into cheers, Amelia couldn't shake Grant's parting words. This isn't over. A cold certainty settled in her chest. Men like him didn't give up easily. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Amelia, exhausted but triumphant, stepped into the sunlight with Mr. Peterson beside her. You saved my life, he said, his voice trembling with gratitude. I don't know how I can ever thank you. Amelia smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. You don't have to. Just live your life and take care of the people who matter to you. He nodded, tears shining in his eyes. You're going to be an incredible lawyer someday. The praise felt good, but Amelia's mind was already racing ahead. Grant's final words echoed in her head. This isn't over. Lily and Ethan waited at the edge of the crowd, their faces alight with excitement. Amelia, Lily shouted, waving her arms. You're famous now. Look at all these reporters. Amelia laughed, though the weight of the day pressed down on her. Let's get out of here, she said. I need a break. Later that evening, Amelia sat at her small kitchen table, flipping through her brother's old law books. The victory in court felt distant, like a dream. Her mind kept drifting back to the bigger picture. Grant's arrest was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. James was still in prison, his wrongful conviction casting a shadow over her triumph. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Lily. Hey, Amelia said, answering the call. What's up? Lily's voice was hurried, almost frantic. Amelia, have you seen the news? No, Amelia replied, frowning. Why? Turn it on. Now. Amelia grabbed the remote and switched on the TV. The screen lit up with a breaking news banner. The anchor's calm voice belied the gravity of her words. Breaking news tonight. Victor Grant, who was detained earlier today on charges of fabricating evidence, has been released on bail. Sources indicate that his legal team is preparing to mount a vigorous defense, claiming the allegations against him are part of a smear campaign orchestrated by former employees. Amelia's jaw tightened. Released on bail already. Amelia, are you hearing this? Lily's voice crackled through the phone. He's not going down without a fight. I know, Amelia said, her mind racing. He's trying to flip the narrative, make himself the victim. It's exactly what I expected. What are you going to do? Lily asked. Amelia stared at the TV, her resolve hardening. I'm going to fight. He's not getting away with this. The next morning, Amelia woke early and headed to the local library. She knew that taking down someone like Grant required more than determination. It required real, undeniable evidence, evidence that couldn't be spun or dismissed. Amelia pored over public records, financial documents, and anything else that might expose Victor Grant's deeper wrongdoings. Hours passed, and the library began to empty as the sun set. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen, but she refused to stop. Just as she was about to call it a night, something caught her eye. A series of payments made to an obscure consulting firm. The amounts were large, irregular, and coincided with key dates in James's trial. Her heart raced. The consulting firm's name wasn't familiar, but the pattern was unmistakable. She jotted down every detail, her mind spinning with possibilities. Was this the missing link? Could this tie Grant to the suppression of evidence in James's case? Exhaustion forgotten, she dug deeper, scrolling through more records. Suddenly, a name appeared that made her pause. Henry Willis, the man who had brought the USB drive to court. His name was listed as a former employee of the consulting firm. Amelia leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. Willis wasn't just a random whistleblower. He was connected to Grant's operation. If she could get him to talk, really talk, she might finally have the evidence she needed to exonerate James. The following day, Amelia tracked Willis down. He lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, the building worn and unassuming. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding. After a long moment, the door creaked open, and Willis peeked out, his eyes wary. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. "It's not safe." "I need your help," Amelia said, her tone pleading. "You came forward in court, but there's more to this, isn't there? You know things about Grant, things that could clear my brother's name." Willis hesitated, his expression conflicted. "You don't understand. People like Grant don't just let things go. If I say too much, I'll be next." "I'll protect you," Amelia said firmly. "You did the right thing once. Do it again, and we can take him down for good." Willis sighed, rubbing his temples. "You don't get it, kid. This goes deeper than you think. Grant's just the tip of the iceberg. There are people behind him, powerful people. They'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets buried." Amelia's stomach twisted, but she refused to back down. "If we don't fight them, they'll keep doing this. Innocent people like my brother will keep paying the price." Willis looked at her, something shifting in his expression. He seemed to weigh her words, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly, "but if we do this, you need to be ready. Once we start pulling at these threads, there's no going back." "I'm ready," Amelia said, her voice steady. Willis stepped aside, letting her into the apartment. "All right," he said, closing the door behind her. "Let's get to work." As Amelia and Willis began to unravel the web of corruption surrounding Victor Grant, the stakes grew higher. Each piece of evidence they uncovered led to more questions and more danger. Amelia knew she was walking a fine line, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the truth was finally within reach. Then, one night, everything changed. When Amelia returned home from another late meeting with Willis, she found her apartment door ajar. Her heart sank, dread pooling in her stomach. She pushed the door open slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears. Inside, the apartment was ransacked. Papers were scattered, furniture overturned, and her laptop was gone. On the kitchen table sat a single note, its words scrawled in bold, menacing letters. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." Amelia's blood ran cold. Grant's words from the courtroom replayed in her mind. This isn't over. He was coming for her, and he wasn't playing fair. She stared at the note, her hands trembling as a mixture of fear and anger coursed through her. Taking a deep breath, she tried to steady herself. Whoever had broken into her apartment had sent a clear message. Stop digging or face the consequences. But if they thought a scare tactic would make her back down, they didn't know her. She grabbed her phone and dialed Lily. "Lily," she said, her voice shaking. "Someone broke into my apartment." "What?" Lily's voice shot up in alarm. "Are you okay? Where are you now?" "I'm fine," Amelia said, though her heart was still racing. "I just got home, and everything's trashed. They took my laptop." Lily's voice softened. "Amelia, you need to call the police." Amelia hesitated. "I don't know. What if they can't do anything? What if this just escalates things?" "You can't handle this alone," Lily said firmly. "Promise me you'll at least tell someone." Amelia sighed. "Okay, I will." The police arrived within the hour. 2 officers surveyed the damage, their faces grim as Amelia explained the situation. She handed them the note, watching as one of the officers bagged it as evidence. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" one officer asked. Amelia hesitated. She didn't want to reveal too much and risk tipping off Grant or his allies. I've been involved in a legal case, she said carefully. It's possible this is connected to that. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. We'll file a report and have our team look into it. In the meantime, I suggest staying somewhere else for a few days, just to be safe. Thanks, Amelia said, though she knew she couldn't afford to slow down. If anything, this attack only reinforced her resolve. The next morning, Amelia met with Henry Willis in a quiet diner far from her usual haunts. She hadn't told him about the break-in over the phone, fearing their calls might be monitored. When she explained what had happened, his face darkened. "This is exactly what I warned you about," Willis said, his voice low. "Grant's people don't play fair. If they're willing to break into your apartment, they're willing to do worse." "I'm not scared of them," Amelia said, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her confidence. "We're too close to the truth to stop now." Willis shook his head. "You don't get it. It's not just Grant. There's an entire network of people behind him. Politicians, executives, even law enforcement. They all have something to lose if we expose this." Amelia leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "Then we expose all of them. We've got the hard drive, and we know there's more out there. If we can gather enough evidence, they won't be able to silence us." Willis sighed, rubbing his temples. "You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. But guts won't protect you if they decide you're too much of a threat." Amelia thought about the note, the violation of her safe space, and the weight of what she was up against. Then she thought about James, sitting in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit. She thought about Mr. Peterson, whose life had been nearly destroyed. She couldn't walk away. Not now. "What's the next step?" Amelia asked, her voice steady. Willis hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. "This is everything I've got on the consulting firm. If we can trace the money, we'll find the people pulling the strings." Amelia opened the folder and scanned the documents: bank transfers, invoices, internal memos. Each piece was part of a larger puzzle. Her mind raced as she began piecing together the connections, a web of corruption taking shape before her eyes. "This is huge," she whispered, barely audible. "If we can prove this—" "It's not enough," Willis interrupted. "We need more concrete evidence. Something that directly ties these people to their crimes." Amelia nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll find it." Later that evening, Amelia returned to Lily's apartment, where she had been staying for safety. Lily greeted her at the door, her face etched with worry. "You look exhausted," Lily said, pulling her inside. "You've been running yourself into the ground." "I don't have a choice," Amelia replied, sinking onto the couch. "If we don't move fast, Grant and his people will bury everything." Lily sat beside her, handing her a cup of tea. "Just promise me you'll be careful, okay? I don't want to lose you." Amelia managed a faint smile. "I promise." A few nights later, Amelia and Willis made their move. Armed with the information from the folder, they infiltrated an office building owned by the consulting firm. The plan was risky. Find the files they needed, copy them, and get out before anyone noticed. The building was eerily quiet as they slipped inside, the dim glow of emergency lights their only guide. Willis led the way to a small server room, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. "This is it," he whispered, pulling out a flash drive. "Watch the door." Amelia nodded, her heart pounding as she kept an eye on the hallway. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, Willis gave a quiet exclamation of triumph. "Got it," he said, pocketing the flash drive. "Let's go." But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Amelia's stomach dropped. Two security guards appeared, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Hey, stop right there," one of them shouted. Amelia and Willis froze, their minds racing. They had been caught, and the stakes had just risen to a dangerous new level. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as the guards closed in, their flashlights glaring like spotlights in the dim hallway. She glanced at Willis, who looked equally frozen. Her mind raced for an escape plan, knowing that getting caught would mean losing everything they had risked to uncover. "Stay calm," Willis whispered, though his trembling hands betrayed his nerves. Hands where we can see them, one of the guards barked, stepping closer. Amelia slowly raised her hands, her heart pounding like a drum. She exchanged a glance with Willis, her eyes pleading for an idea. Any idea. One of the guards reached for his radio. "This is Team A," he said. "We've got 2 intruders on the 2nd floor. Requesting backup." The second guard gestured with his flashlight. "Move. Both of you. You're coming with us." Amelia's pulse quickened. If they were taken in, their mission would be over. She had to act. "Wait," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We can explain." The guards exchanged skeptical looks. "Explain what?" one of them asked. "You're trespassing." "You're right," Amelia said quickly, trying to buy time. "And we'll go with you. But first, I need to show you something. It's on that flash drive." Willis shot her a startled look, but she ignored him. The guards hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her calm demeanor. "Look," she continued, her tone urgent. "What's on that drive could save your jobs, maybe even your lives. But only if you see it before you call for backup." One of the guards frowned. "What kind of game are you playing?" "No games," Amelia said, lowering her voice. "Do you even know who you work for? Do you know what they're hiding?" The guards exchanged uneasy glances. "You've seen things, haven't you? Things that don't add up?" Amelia pressed, sensing a crack in their resolve. "This drive has the proof. Just give us 5 minutes. If you still think we're lying, we'll go quietly." The first guard's flashlight wavered. Finally, he grunted. "You've got 2 minutes. But if this is some kind of trick—" "It's not," Amelia said firmly. She handed the flash drive to Willis, who inserted it into his laptop with shaking hands. The guards leaned over as the screen lit up, revealing a series of incriminating files. Emails detailing bribes, invoices for fabricated evidence, and wire transfers to offshore accounts. The guards' faces darkened as they scrolled through the files. This is real," one of them muttered. Amelia nodded. "That's why we're here. If this gets out, the people behind it will try to bury us, and you. But if we work together, we can stop them." The guards exchanged a long look. Finally, the first one sighed. "We didn't see you," he said, stepping back. "But you need to leave. Now." "Thank you," Amelia said, her voice filled with relief. She and Willis packed up quickly, the tension in the air still heavy as they slipped out of the building. Back at Lily's apartment, Amelia felt a rush of adrenaline and gratitude. They had narrowly escaped, but the evidence they had gathered could change everything. Amelia and Willis pored over the files late into the night. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of the corruption at the heart of Victor Grant's operations. But as they connected the dots, a darker truth began to emerge. "This isn't just about Grant," Willis said, his voice grim. He tapped the screen, highlighting a series of payments. "These accounts, these transactions, they trace back to major corporations and even politicians." Amelia's stomach churned. She had expected corruption, but not on this scale. "What do we do with this?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "If we go public, they'll come after us." Willis hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We need someone who can protect us and expose this at the same time. Someone with real power." The next day, Amelia reached out to Sarah Green, an investigative journalist she had read about in one of James's old law books. Known for taking down high-profile criminals, Sarah had a reputation for being fearless and relentless. Amelia sent her an encrypted email detailing their findings and asking for a meeting. To her surprise, Sarah responded within hours. The meeting was set for that evening at a discreet cafe downtown. Amelia and Willis arrived early, nerves on edge as they scanned the quiet space. When Sarah walked in, her commanding presence filled the room. She wore a leather jacket and carried a laptop bag, her sharp eyes sweeping the cafe before she approached their table. "You must be Amelia," Sarah said, her tone brisk as she slid into the seat across from them. "And you're Willis. Let's see what you've got." Willis handed over the flash drive. Sarah plugged it into her laptop, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the files. Minutes ticked by, the tension between Amelia and Willis palpable. Finally, Sarah looked up, her face serious. "This is huge," she said. "If this is all verified, It could bring down some of the most powerful people in the country. That's why we need your help, Amelia said, her voice firm. We can't do this alone. Sarah leaned back, her gaze thoughtful. I can get this out to the public, but you need to be prepared for the fallout. People will come after you. Hard. Are you ready for that? Amelia hesitated, glancing at Willis. He looked exhausted, but his determination hadn't wavered. We're ready, she said. For the next week, Sarah worked tirelessly to verify the evidence and prepare her story. Amelia and Willis stayed in hiding, knowing that each step forward brought them closer to exposing the truth and closer to danger. One night, as Amelia sat by the window of Lily's apartment, her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. It's going live tomorrow. Be ready. Amelia's heart raced. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth about Victor Grant and the web of corruption he was part of. But as she stared at the text, a sense of foreboding crept over her. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds as Amelia sat at the edge of the couch, staring at her phone. At 7 a.m. sharp, Sarah's story went live. The headline blazed across multiple platforms. The hidden web, corruption, conspiracy, and the fight for justice. Within minutes, the story went viral. News anchors dissected the evidence. Politicians scrambled to issue statements, and social media exploded with outrage. The article detailed everything: Victor Grant's role, the falsified evidence, the consulting firm's shady dealings, and the broader network of corruption that reached into industries and government alike. Amelia felt a flicker of pride. This was what she and Willis had worked for. But the victory felt fleeting, overshadowed by a gnawing sense of dread. They had exposed the truth, but they had also painted targets on their backs. By noon, Sarah called. Her tone was urgent. Amelia, it's a firestorm. The DOJ is opening an investigation, and Grant's associates are scrambling. But there's something you need to know. Amelia gripped the phone tightly. What is it? Grant's gone, Sarah said. He didn't show up to his scheduled court appearance this morning. Word is he skipped town. Amelia's chest tightened. Gone? How? I thought he was under surveillance. So did I, Sarah replied, frustration lacing her voice. But someone helped him. I'm digging into it, but you need to be careful. If Grant's on the run, he might try to retaliate. Amelia swallowed hard. Thanks for letting me know. That evening, tension hung thick in the air at Lily's apartment. Willis paced the living room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I told you this would happen, he muttered. Grant's too slippery to go down without a fight. He's probably planning his next move right now. Amelia sat quietly, her mind spinning. He's desperate, she said finally. That makes him dangerous. But it also makes him reckless. If he tries something, we'll be ready. Ready for what? Willis snapped. You think we can predict his next move? He's got resources, connections. He could do anything. Amelia looked up at him, her gaze steady. We've come too far to give up now. The truth is out there, and people are paying attention. That's what matters. Willis sighed, running a hand through his hair. I hope you're right. The next day, the fallout from Sarah's article continued to ripple through the media. Protests erupted outside government buildings, demanding accountability. The Justice Department announced a task force to investigate the implicated corporations and officials. Amelia watched the coverage with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The wheels of justice were turning, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. Her fears were confirmed that evening. As she and Willis sat at the kitchen table, reviewing documents, a sudden noise outside made them both freeze. The fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. Lily burst into the apartment, her face ashen. You need to see this, she said, holding up her phone. Amelia took the phone, her stomach sinking as she read the message Lily had received. A chilling warning from an anonymous number. Get out while you can. They know where you are. Who sent this? Amelia asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, Lily said. It came out of nowhere. Willis stood abruptly. We need to leave. Now. Amelia hesitated. What if it's a bluff? Do you really want to take that chance? Willis's voice was sharp, insistent. Amelia knew he was right. They packed what little they had and slipped out of the apartment under the cover of darkness, moving quickly and quietly. Willis had arranged for them to stay at a safe house owned by a friend, a small cabin in the woods, far from prying eyes. The cabin was quiet, secluded, but the tension between them was palpable. Amelia spent her days glued to news updates, trying to stay ahead of the ever-encroaching danger. Willis, meanwhile, kept his phone close, ready to leave at a moment's notice. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, Willis broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what happens after this?" Amelia glanced up from her laptop. "After what?" "After Grant's gone. After the investigation. After the dust settles." Amelia sighed, her voice quiet. "I don't know. I just want James to be free. After that, I haven't really thought about it." Willis nodded, a distant look in his eyes. "I used to think about it all the time. What life would be like if I hadn't gotten involved with Grant. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head, "now it feels like there's no way out." "There is a way out," Amelia said firmly. "We just have to keep fighting." Willis didn't respond, but the doubt in his eyes lingered. The next morning, Amelia's phone buzzed. It was Sarah, and her tone was urgent. "Amelia, we've got a lead on Grant. He's holed up in a private estate outside the city. Word is, he's meeting with some of his associates to plan his next move." Amelia's heart raced. "Do you think he's trying to flee the country?" "It's possible," Sarah replied, "but we can't let him. If he gets away, everything we've worked for could fall apart. What can we do?" Amelia asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. "I've got a contact in law enforcement," Sarah said. "If you're willing to testify about what you know, we might be able to get a warrant to raid the estate." Amelia hesitated. Testifying would put her directly in the crosshairs, but it might be the only way to bring Grant down for good. "I'll do it," she said finally. The next few hours were a blur. Sarah's contact, a determined federal agent named Detective Ramirez, met with Amelia to review her testimony. By the end of the day, a warrant had been issued, and a raid was planned for dawn. As Amelia prepared for what was to come, a strange sense of calm settled over her. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let fear stop her. Not now. Not ever. When the sun rose the next morning, Amelia stood with Sarah and Detective Ramirez outside the estate, watching as law enforcement surrounded the property. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, with a single shout, the raid began. Amelia's breath caught as agents stormed the estate, the sound of breaking glass and shouted orders filling the air. She strained to see what was happening, her heart pounding with anticipation. And then, through the chaos, she saw him. Victor Grant, handcuffed and furious, being dragged out by two agents. Their eyes met for a brief moment, his face twisted in anger, but Amelia stood tall, unflinching. She had won this battle. But the war wasn't over, not until every piece of the puzzle was revealed. Later that evening, Amelia sat in the quiet conference room of a federal office, exhausted but resolute. Detective Ramirez handed her a cup of coffee and offered a small smile. "You did good," he said. "Grant's in custody, and the evidence you and Sarah provided is enough to keep him there." Amelia nodded, though she knew the fight wasn't over. "What about his network? The people behind him?" Ramirez's expression turned serious. "We're building a case. The documents you found were a goldmine, but dismantling something this big takes time. It won't be easy, but it's a start." At that moment, Sarah entered the room, her phone in hand and a triumphant look on her face. "The story's everywhere," she said. "Grant's arrest is trending on every major platform. Public pressure is mounting, and the DOJ has officially expanded their investigation." For the first time in weeks, Amelia allowed herself a small smile. It's finally happening. The next few days were a whirlwind. News outlets dissected every detail of the case, exposing a web of corruption that stretched further than Amelia had ever imagined. High-ranking officials were implicated. Resignations flooded in. Investigations were launched across multiple industries. The dominoes were falling. Amelia felt a growing sense of pride, knowing she had played a part in it. But amidst the chaos, her mind kept returning to one name, James. With Grant in custody and the truth about the falsified evidence exposed, Amelia knew it was time to take the next step. 3 weeks later, Amelia stood outside the courthouse, where her brother's appeal hearing was taking place. She adjusted the blazer she had borrowed from Lily and took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She wasn't representing James officially. That was being handled by a seasoned attorney Sarah had connected her with. But Amelia had fought tooth and nail to make this day possible. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Amelia sat in the front row, her hands clenched in her lap as the defense presented the newly uncovered evidence. The suppressed security footage, the forged emails, and Grant's involvement in fabricating the case against James. When it was time for closing arguments, the defense attorney looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, the evidence before you is clear. My client, James Carter, was wrongfully convicted due to the actions of corrupt individuals who manipulated the system for their own gain. Today, we have the opportunity to correct that injustice." The judge's decision came quickly. As he read the words, Amelia felt the weight of years of pain and frustration lift from her shoulders. The conviction of James Carter is hereby vacated. He is to be released immediately. Tears streamed down Amelia's face as the courtroom erupted in cheers. James, now standing beside his attorney, turned to her with a wide, disbelieving grin. She ran to him, throwing her arms around him in a hug that felt like it could last forever. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You actually did it." "We did it," Amelia corrected, pulling back to look at him. "You believed in me when no one else did. I just returned the favor." In the weeks that followed, Amelia found herself in a whirlwind of attention. Reporters wanted interviews. Activists reached out with messages of support. Even law schools sent her letters of encouragement. But Amelia's focus was on what came next. Sitting across from James at their parents' dining room table one evening, she laid out her plan. "I want to go to law school," she said. "For real this time. No shortcuts. No disguises. I want to do this the right way." James smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "You'll be amazing." "You think so?" Amelia asked, her voice quiet. "I know so," he said firmly. "You've already done more than most lawyers ever will." Years later, as Amelia stood in her own courtroom, now an official attorney, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her there. She thought about the people she had fought for, the battles she had won, and the lessons she had learned about courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what was right. Her first client, a young single mother wrongfully accused of theft, sat beside her as she prepared her opening argument. Amelia glanced at the opposing counsel, her voice steady and confident as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I'm here to defend someone who deserves the truth, and I intend to deliver it." And with that, the journey of Amelia Carter, the once mock genius who had stood in a courtroom fighting for justice, came full circle. If Amelia's journey has inspired you, if you believe in the power of truth and justice, don't let this story end here. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of these stories that remind us that change starts with one person daring to fight for what's right. Comment below and let us know. What would you risk to uncover the truth? What stood out to you in Amelia's fight for justice? Your thoughts matter. And if you've ever felt like the odds were against you, like justice was out of reach, don't give up. We're here, sharing these stories because we believe in the power of courage and standing together. So, what's next for you? Hit subscribe, join the journey, and be part of the change.